The morning broke over the Turner Ranch with the kind of quiet that only comes from a life tied to the land. The cicadas were already humming, their song weaving through the warm Tennessee air, and the faint crackle of an old radio spilled from the barn, playing Johnny Cash like it was still 1968. I was out by the south pasture, knee-deep in the work of patching a sagging fence line, my hands stained with dirt and sweat. At 52, I'd learned to love these mornings, not for their peace, but for their rhythm. The land didn't care about your aches or your worries. It just asked you to show up. Beside me, my father, Henry Turner, worked with the steady focus of a man who'd seen 6 decades of sunrises. His flannel shirt was rolled to the elbows, and a cigarette dangled from his lips, the smoke curling upward like a lazy ghost. At 78, he moved slower than he used to, but his eyes were sharp, and his hands still knew every knot and wire. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. The ranch, sprawled across 200 acres of rolling hills and creek beds, spoke for us. That's when we saw it, a plume of dust rising along the ridge road, too clean and deliberate to belong to any local rig. Our trucks were caked in red clay. This one gleamed like it had never seen a dirt path. I straightened up, wiping my brow, and Henry paused, his cigarette glowing as he squinted toward the horizon. "In one of ours," he muttered, and I nodded. The road was private, marked by a weathered sign that read, "Turner Land, no trespassing." Whoever this was, they weren't invited. The vehicle came into view, a white pickup, so polished it looked like it belonged in a car commercial. It rolled past the sign, down the slope, and parked right in the middle of our barn lot, next to Henry's hay trailer and the old feeding troughs where his mutt, Rusty, liked to nap. The side of the truck bore stenciled letters, Community Patrol. No badge, no official seal, just a cheap magnetic decal that screamed trouble. 2 men stepped out. The first was young, maybe 25, with the nervous posture of someone dragged into something he didn't fully understand. The second was older, mid-40s, sporting knockoff aviators and a clipboard he clutched like it was a badge of honor. They didn't glance at the signs or the chained cattle gate they'd nudged open. Instead, they strutted toward the barn lot like they owned every blade of grass. Henry didn't yell. He never did when trouble showed up. He took a long drag on his cigarette, flicked the ash into the dirt, and muttered, "Here we go." Then he dusted off his jeans and started walking toward them, his boots crunching the gravel with purpose. I followed, not because he needed backup, but because I knew this was going to be worth seeing. "Can I help you?" Henry asked, his voice calm, but laced with the kind of gravel that warned you to choose your words carefully. The clipboard guy straightened up, adjusting his sunglasses like he was about to address a crowd. "We've had reports of zoning violations and unauthorized equipment storage near this property line," he said, his tone practiced but overdone, like he'd rehearsed it in a mirror. "We're with the Clearview Community Expansion Team, conducting routine compliance checks." I raised an eyebrow. Clearview? There wasn't a community association within 10 miles of our ranch. The nearest subdivision was a good 20-minute drive, and even they didn't have the nerve to call themselves Clearview. Henry didn't respond right away. He turned, took a few steps toward the barn, and pointed a thumb at the tow rig parked by the fence, a beat-up Chevy that had hauled more trouble than most folks could imagine. "You've got 30 seconds, he said, pulling the cigarette from his mouth and tapping the ash again. "That truck's still there after that. It's going for a swim." The younger guy let out a nervous laugh, like he thought Henry was joking. The clipboard guy just blinked, then adjusted his sunglasses again, as if that would make the situation clearer. "Sir, cooperation is required under regional ordinances," he started, but Henry was already moving. He climbed into the tow rig, cranked the engine, and the old diesel roared to life like it knew what was coming. I'll admit, I thought he might be bluffing. We'd dealt with pushy developers and nosy bureaucrats before, but they usually stayed at the fence line, shouting about permits from a safe distance. These guys were different. They'd parked smack in the middle of our working land, spouting nonsense about regulations we didn't fall under. Henry wasn't the type to let that slide. He backed the tow rig up, grabbed a chain from the rack, and started hooking it to the rear axle of the pickup. The clipboard guy finally snapped out of his daze, waving his arms and shouting about lawsuits and impound violations. The younger one ran after the truck, yelling something incoherent. Henry didn't blink. The chain clicked into place, and with a tap of the gas, the shiny white pickup lurched backward, its tires kicking up dirt. The next few minutes were a blur of motion and chaos. Henry hauled the truck out of the barn lot, over the gravel path, past the pasture fence, and down toward the creek. The slope wasn't steep, but after a spring rain, it was slick with mud, a perfect trap for pride and bad decisions. He hit the brakes just long enough to time the swing, then released the chain with a loud clunk. The pickup, still in neutral, slid down the slope and landed nose first in the shallow bank. Water splashed, mud flew, and the community patrol decal peeled away like it was ashamed to be seen. The clipboard guy stood frozen, his sunglasses gone, his socks soaked in creek water. His face was redder than the barn paint, and his mouth moved like he was trying to form words but couldn't. The younger guy was scrambling to pull his phone out, probably to record the scene, but Henry was already one step ahead. He snapped a photo of the truck, half submerged and pathetic, then dialed the sheriff. "Got some trespassers out here, claiming to be community enforcers," he said into the phone, his voice as steady as ever. "Might want to check their paperwork before I toss their clipboard in too." The men didn't try to run. Their truck wasn't going anywhere, and neither was Henry. He stood at the top of the hill, arms crossed, looking like a man who'd just settled a score. 15 minutes later, a deputy's cruiser rolled in, lights off but window down. The deputy, a wiry guy named Carl who'd known Henry since they were kids, stepped out and took one look at the scene. "Let me guess," Carl said, eyeing the soggy truck. "Didn't read the sign." "Didn't read much of anything," Henry replied, handing him a towel from the horse trough. Carl smirked, walked over to the clipboard guy, and asked for ID. It was clear this wasn't going to be a quick visit. The clipboard guy, now looking like a drowned rat, fumbled in his pocket and pulled out a laminated card that looked like it had been made in someone's basement. Carl didn't even take it. He just glanced at it, then at the man's face, giving him a chance to backtrack. When the guy doubled down, muttering about being a compliance observer for some non-existent Clearview subcommittee, Carl sighed and slipped the card into his notepad. "This says you're with the Community Expansion Division," Carl read aloud, his tone dripping with skepticism. "Funny, 'cause there ain't no such thing in this county. And even if there was, it wouldn't give you the right to park on private land without permission." The man stammered, throwing out buzzwords about proposed jurisdictions and boundary assessments. Henry wasn't listening. He walked over to the truck, popped the tailgate, and started rummaging through the contents. Inside were a few folders, a walkie-talkie, and a stack of notices stamped with a logo nobody recognized. Carl followed, pulling on gloves and flipping through the papers. He pulled out a folded map, and his expression darkened. The map had our ranch circled in red, with handwritten notes about water access and zoning disputes. A line ran from our creek to a green-shaded area marked future development. It wasn't a compliance document. It was a plan, and not a legal one. "Looks like a development schematic," Carl muttered, his eyes narrowing. "I figured as much when they parked on my hay," Henry said, his voice flat but heavy with meaning. Carl radioed for backup and turned to the younger guy, who'd been quiet the whole time, pacing nervously by the fence. "You in on this?" he asked. "I just ride along," the kid stammered. "My uncle said it was a summer job. I didn't know it was illegal." "Who's your uncle?" Carl pressed. "Walter Grayson," the kid blurted. The name hit like a hammer. Walter Grayson was a slick developer who lived in a glass mansion by the lake. He'd been pushing for subdivisions in our area for years, always talking about modernizing the county. 2 years ago, he'd gotten into a shouting match with Henry at a town meeting, calling ranchers inefficient landholders. Now it all made sense. Carl nodded slowly. "I'll be calling Mr. Grayson next," he said, then turned to the tow truck. "And we'll need a crew to get this thing out of the creek." The clipboard guy tried one last argument, claiming it was all a misunderstanding. Henry cut him off. "You're lucky I didn't hook up the backhoe today," he said, tossing the man's clipboard into the grass. The guy glared but said nothing. By the time the tow crew arrived, Carl had called in someone from zoning enforcement. The situation wasn't just about trespassing anymore. It was about fraud and impersonation. The fake enforcer was taken away, head down, while the kid stayed behind, waiting for a ride. Henry didn't say much, but I saw him set a cold soda on the fence post near the kid before walking away. As the sun dipped behind the hills, I sat with Henry on the porch, the wood creaking under our boots. He stared toward the creek, where the truck's skid marks were still visible in the mud. "Think that's the last of him?" I asked. "Not a chance," he said, lighting another cigarette. "But next time, they'll need more than a clipboard." The air felt heavier now, like the land itself was holding its breath. Henry was already planning, and when he planned, trouble had a way of regretting it ever showed up. The next morning, the ranch woke up to the same rhythm: roosters crowing, the faint hum of cicadas, and the smell of dew-soaked hay. But there was a new edge to the air, like the calm before a storm. I found Henry by the creek, a cup of black coffee in one hand and a shovel in the other. He wasn't digging, not yet, but the way he scanned the dirt told me his mind was already 3 steps ahead. At 78, Henry didn't move fast, but he moved with purpose, and that was more dangerous than any speed. I joined him, my boots sinking into the damp earth, and followed his gaze. That's when I noticed them, wooden stakes, painted white and spaced too evenly to be random, lined up along the tree line. They hadn't been there yesterday. Each one had a strip of orange survey tape fluttering in the breeze, and a small sticker near the top bore a company logo and a barcode. Henry crouched, tugged one free, and turned it over in his hand. His eyes narrowed, and he let out a low grunt. "Development stakes," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're not just scouting. They're planning." We followed the line of stakes down to where the creek bent around a soft patch of mud, a quiet, shaded spot perfect for fishing or, as it now seemed, for digging. Henry kicked his boot into the earth and muttered something about rats burrowing where they don't belong. I didn't need to ask what he meant. Whoever sent that fake patrol truck wasn't just testing our patience. They were after our water. Back at the house, Henry pulled a dusty box from the closet, one I hadn't seen since I was a kid. Inside were stacks of papers, old maps, and a thick file labeled water rights. He spread them across the dining room table, his fingers tracing faded stamps and handwritten notes. Our ranch wasn't just private property. It came with creek access and flow rights, grandfathered in before the county even dreamed of water permits. Any pipeline through that bend would violate federal law, not just local rules. "We're going to town," Henry said, folding the map and tucking it into his jacket. "Come see who's signing these stakes." The zoning office was a squat, tin building that smelled of burnt coffee and cheap air conditioning. We didn't bother with the receptionist, just marched straight to the planning department. Henry slammed one of the stakes down on the counter, startling a clerk who looked like she hadn't slept since the Reagan administration. "Why's a development company planting these across my creek?" he asked, his voice even but sharp enough to cut glass. The clerk adjusted her glasses, picked up the stake, and blinked like it was a foreign object. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but Henry was already unfolding the map from the fake patrol truck. He pointed to the green-shaded zone marked Future Development Phase 1, then jabbed a finger at the line running through our property. "I want to know who filed this, when, and why they think they can run a water line through a ranch that's been ours since before this county had paved roads," he said. The clerk typed for a minute, her frown deepening. "This wasn't filed through our office," she said carefully. "It's a third-party contractor submission, unapproved. The name listed is a subsidiary under Grayson Land and Water Solutions." Henry glanced at me, and I felt the pieces click into place. Walter Grayson, the same slick-talking developer whose nephew was part of the fake patrol crew. The same man who'd been pushing for streamlined zoning for years, always with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He wasn't just after houses. He wanted our water. Outside, the sun baked the asphalt as we crossed the parking lot. Henry stopped by the truck, pulled out his phone, and dialed a number. "Sheriff," he said when the call connected, his voice low. "Found survey stakes along the creek. Developer tags. It's Grayson again. You still got that contact with the state water board?" He nodded once, ended the call, and climbed into the truck. I could tell he wasn't just angry. He was calculating the slow, simmering kind of focus that burned hotter than any outburst. That night, we set up a trail camera by the creek, the kind we used to catch coyotes sniffing around the chicken coop. Henry had spotted fresh tire marks near one of the stakes, and if anyone came back, we'd have proof. Just before dawn, the camera's motion sensor pinged. We didn't hear it first, but when Henry checked the SD card that morning, we saw everything. Two men in plain clothes, one with a measuring wheel, the other with a GPS pole, mapping the stake line in near silence. They weren't amateurs. One wore a company vest with a logo matching the stake stickers. They worked for 10 minutes, then left. We had timestamps, faces, and gear. We took the footage to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Dan, a broad-shouldered man who'd hunted with Henry back in the day, didn't smirk this time. He printed the images, made a few calls, and asked us to wait. An hour later, a man in a gray suit arrived, introducing himself as Tom Reynolds from the state's Environmental Division. He listened as Henry laid it all out. The fake patrol, the stakes, the nighttime survey team. Then Reynolds pulled a folder from his bag. Inside were photos from other properties, all with similar stakes and decals. One showed a bulldozer digging near a creek like ours. Another had the same Grayson logo on a black pipeline coil. They're testing boundaries, Reynolds said, his voice grim. Pushing where they think no one's watching. Henry didn't hesitate. They picked the wrong ranch. As we drove home, the silence in the truck was different, not angry but resolute. Henry was sketching something in his head, and I knew better than to interrupt. By the time we reached the ranch, he was already pulling out a notepad, drawing what looked like a new fence line with wires, solar panels, and cameras. He handed me the notepad and said, "Start measuring. I'm building a line they won't forget." The next morning, Henry was out before dawn, a sledgehammer in one hand and a post driver in the other. His boots crushed the grass like it had insulted him, and the truck bed rattled with metal stakes and spools of barbed wire. This wasn't just a fence, it was a statement. I followed, hauling tools and trying to keep up. At 52, I wasn't slow, but Henry at 78 could outwork most men half his age when he was on a mission. The plan was simple but brutal. Outnumber Grayson's stakes with our own, mark the old property boundaries, and make it clear this land wasn't for sale. We added motion sensors, solar lights, and cameras hidden in the brush. Henry even had me nail up signs with messages like "Trespassers will be photographed, shamed, and escorted by bull." I chuckled at that one, but Henry just nodded. "Let 'em laugh," he said. "They'll stop when the bull shows up." We were halfway through driving the first post when we heard tires on gravel. Not from the road, but from the pasture's far side, behind the tree line. Henry motioned for me to duck, and we crouched behind the hay trailer. Through the branches, we saw a black SUV with tinted windows and a magnetic decal. Grayson Water Solutions. Out stepped Walter Grayson himself, silver-haired and smug, wearing a vest like he was running for office. Two men in matching vests followed, carrying tablets and clipboards. They didn't see us. They walked the stake line, pointing and making notes. Grayson spread a map across the SUV's hood, gesturing like he was planning a conquest. That's when Henry stood, dusted off his pants, and walked toward them with the calm of a man who already knew the ending. "Morning, Walter," he called out, his voice steady. "Didn't expect to see your boots on my creek bank." Grayson turned, flashing a grin like they were old friends. "Morning, Henry. Didn't expect you up so early." "Didn't expect you trespassing," Henry shot back. "Last I checked, this water's mine, and this land's private." Grayson raised his hands in mock surrender. "Just checking access, Henry. No harm in that. I've got a proposal for the county board next month. Thought I'd get a head start." "Funny thing about starting early," Henry said, stepping closer, "is you might run into a wall you didn't see coming." Grayson's smile faltered, but he recovered fast. "Come on, Henry. This town's changing. These ranches aren't forever. I'm offering you a chance to get ahead. Real money for a 20-foot easement through the creek. You wouldn't even notice it." "I'd notice," Henry said, his voice low and final. "Every time I saw your trucks where my grandkids fish. Every time your pipes flood my field because you didn't ask about runoff. And every time I remember you sent fake enforcers to carve up my land. Grayson's jaw twitched. That wasn't me. Must have been a subcontractor mix-up. That mix-up almost got winched into the river, Henry said. And now you're standing on the same mud, thinking I won't call the sheriff again. Grayson waved his men back, then leaned in. Let's be real, Henry. There's money here, top dollar. You're overreacting. Henry looked at me, still crouched by the trailer, and nodded. I stood and started filming. Grayson saw the phone and turned away fast. You'll regret this, he muttered. There's momentum here. You can't stop it. I don't have to, Henry said. I just have to make sure you trip before you get far. Grayson and his team left, leaving tire ruts and a pair of annoyed hawks circling overhead. We finished the fence by sundown, 3 layers of barbed wire, solar lights, and cameras. Henry added a remote gate lock for good measure. As the sky turned orange, I caught him staring at the creek, his eyes tracing the water's path. They're not done, he said, almost to himself. But neither are we. The new fence stood like a sentinel along the creek, its barbed wire glinting under the Tennessee sun. The solar lights blinked on at dusk, and the trail cameras hummed quietly in the brush, watching for anything that moved. Henry had built more than a barrier. He'd drawn a line in the dirt, one that said, "Cross this, and you'll answer for it." At 52, I'd seen my father face down plenty of trouble, blizzards, bank loans, even a coyote that got too bold. But this was different. This was personal, and Henry wasn't just defending the ranch. He was defending a way of life. The morning after we finished the fence, a county vehicle rolled up our drive, its tires crunching the gravel. A tall man in a tie stepped out, briefcase in hand, and introduced himself as Paul Carter from the County Land Records Division. He held a copy of a complaint filed by Grayson Water Solutions, claiming our new fence encroached on a public utility corridor. Henry didn't blink. He led Carter straight to the creek, pulled out the original deed and water rights from 1962, and handed over a USB drive with the trail cam footage of Grayson's nighttime survey team. Carter reviewed the documents in silence, then unfolded his own maps. After a long pause, he looked up. Grayson's claim has no standing, he said. No registered easement, no notice to property owners, no environmental survey. They were hoping you'd sign and save him the trouble. Henry grunted and nodded toward the camera. They underestimated the trouble. That evening, word came from town that sheriff's deputies and county officials had visited Grayson's field office, a trailer parked on a dusty lot just outside the city limits. They found forged permit documents, maps showing unauthorized expansions across multiple properties, and half a dozen access agreements signed under false pretenses. Walter Grayson wasn't arrested, but he was served with a stack of notices, and his trademark grin was nowhere to be seen. Back on the ranch, Henry set up a folding chair by the creek bank, a mason jar of sweet tea in his hand. He watched the birds settle into the cottonwoods, their shadows dancing on the water. I sat beside him, the air thick with the scent of damp soil and hay. This ain't just about us anymore, he said, his voice low. They're coming for every ranch in the valley. He was right. The fake patrol truck and the survey stakes weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a larger scheme, one that preyed on landowners too tired or too trusting to fight back. But Henry wasn't tired, and he sure as hell wasn't trusting. 3 days later, a state vehicle pulled up, unmarked but unmistakable. The driver was a thin man in tan slacks, carrying a leather folder that looked older than our barn. He introduced himself as James Holt, an inspector from the State Environmental Commission, sent to investigate a complaint from Grayson's company. According to them, our fence was a barrier to public utility access and a threat to the creek's natural flow. Henry chuckled, a sound so soft it was almost menacing, and motioned for Holt to follow him to the barn. Inside, under a pile of old vet manuals and a tin of spare bolts, he pulled out 2 sealed folders. These are the water rights from '62, he said, handing them over. That's a certified topo map from '85, showing the creek's protected designation. And this here's the boundary survey we filed last year, confirmed by your office. Unless Grayson's got invisible water spirits on his side, He's barking up a dead tree. Holt flipped through the papers, asking sharp questions that Henry answered without hesitation, quoting dates and filing numbers from memory. Finally, Holt closed the folder and sighed. "This complaint's paper thin," he admitted. "Likely an attempt to stall or discredit you. I'll report it as an abuse of process." Henry didn't thank him. He just tipped his hat and saw Holt out like he'd never doubted the outcome. That night, he sat at the dining room table, a fresh coffee in hand, and started writing a letter. Not an email, but a real, ink-signed letter to the state land board. Line by line, he requested an investigation into the pattern of survey stakes across neighboring properties, citing harassment, misrepresentation, and environmental violations. He included photos, timestamps, and a hand-drawn map of every illegal stake we'd found. When he finished, he handed it to me. "Drop this at the post office tomorrow," he said, "and swing by the feed store. I need more wire." The next morning, as I backed out of the drive with the letter in hand, a black truck skidded to a stop in front of me. My heart jumped, thinking it was Grayson again, but Deputy Carl stepped out, his face grim. He waved me down and asked for Henry. I pointed to the porch, where Henry was sipping his coffee, unfazed. "Thought you'd want to hear this in person," Carl said, lowering his voice. "Last night, we got a call from a ranch 5 miles east. Same deal, survey stakes, trespassers, no IDs, no permits. Only this time they were digging. A trench, maybe 2 feet wide, prepped for pipeline housing. Found PVC pipes and more of those fake patrol signs nearby." Henry set his cup down. "What were they digging for?" "Water," Carl said. "Same as here. They're not just after land, they're after control." Henry didn't react, just walked inside and returned with a manila envelope. "Here's everything I've logged," he said, handing it to Carl. "Maps, photos, license plates, every stake we pulled. Add it to your report, and tell whoever's letting Grayson play cowboy that next time he crosses my fence, I'm filing for racketeering." Carl nodded, surprised but not shocked. He said the sheriff's office was now working with the county prosecutor and the state attorney general. Things were moving fast, faster than anyone expected. That afternoon, a reporter from the local paper showed up, a young woman named Sarah with a notepad and a recorder. Word had spread about the truck in the creek, and someone had tipped her off about Grayson's scam. Henry didn't want to talk at first, but Sarah was persistent, and he eventually sat with her by the fence line. He told her the truth, plain and simple. All it takes for these companies to steal your land is a fake form, a decal, and the hope you're too worn out to fight. They messed with the wrong ranch. The story ran that Sunday under the headline, "Rancher Tows Fake Patrol in a Creek, Exposes Developer Scam." The photo was perfect. Henry standing by the water, arms crossed, the truck's nose still visible in the mud. It went viral, spreading across social media and local news sites. Calls poured in from neighboring counties. Emails flooded the sheriff's office. Other ranchers started checking their fields, pulling up stakes they'd ignored until now. Grayson's quiet scheme was now front-page news. By week's end, the state froze all permits tied to Grayson's company. His trailer office was raided again, this time by state agents with cameras and clipboards of their own. Files were seized, equipment tagged, workers questioned. Henry watched it unfold with the patience of a man who knew the truth would catch up, even if it took its time. The final letter arrived 2 days later from the county land registry. Grayson's claim to a utility corridor through our creek was revoked for improper documentation and failure to notify landowners. Better yet, a contested patch of land near our southern fence was officially registered under our name, thanks to historical usage records. Henry didn't celebrate. He just folded the letter, filed it under victory, and said, figured they'd owe us something. The ranch felt different after that. The air still carried the same crisp bite, the same hum of cicadas, but there was a quiet pride now, like the land itself was standing taller. Henry's routine didn't change. Up before dawn, feeding the animals, yelling at the barn cat for knocking over the feed bucket, but I noticed his eyes lingered on the fence post a little longer, the corners of his mouth twitching just enough to show he was satisfied. One afternoon, while we were mending some wiring near the pasture's back end, the trail camera pinged. I'd set it up to send live feeds to Henry's phone, despite his grumbling about fancy nonsense. He tapped the screen and held it up. Two men in button-up shirts and dusty jeans stood by the creek, eyeing the water like they were sizing it up. No clipboards, no trucks, just the same suspicious posture we'd come to know. Henry didn't speak. He grabbed his heavier boots and the old tow hook from the barn. We didn't confront them right away, just watched from the slope. The men lingered a few minutes, then one took a photo before they slipped back into the brush. That was enough for Henry. He whistled low, and our dogs, Scout and Dusty, tore across the field, their barks echoing like thunder. The men bolted, slipping in the mud before vanishing into the trees. The dogs didn't chase far, just enough to make the point. "Might need another sign," Henry said, nodding with approval. "Something with bigger letters." We were barely back to the house when Sheriff Dan called. Grayson had declared bankruptcy. The state had frozen his accounts, seized his equipment, and opened a formal investigation into environmental fraud and land misrepresentation. Multiple landowners were pressing charges, and the county had issued a cease and desist order on anything tied to Grayson Water Solutions. Walter himself had packed up and left town, some saying he'd gone west, others claiming he'd fled the country. Henry listened in silence, then hung up. He didn't care where Grayson went. The fight wasn't about one man. It was about the land, and the land was still ours. The ranch settled into a new kind of normal after the dust-up with Grayson. The creek ran clear again, its banks undisturbed except for the occasional deer or heron. The fence stood proud, its solar lights casting a soft glow at night, and the trail cameras clicked only for wildlife, coyotes, raccoons, once a bobcat that stared right into the lens like it knew it was being watched. But Henry wasn't one to let his guard down. At 78, he'd seen enough to know trouble didn't always announce itself with a shiny truck or a clipboard. Sometimes it crept in quietly, waiting for you to blink. I was out checking the fence line one morning, my boots crunching through frost-tipped grass, when I noticed something off. One of the new posts was leaning slightly, not enough to fall, but enough to catch my eye. I crouched and saw the dirt around its base had been disturbed, like someone had tried to pry it loose. A few feet away, tucked in the brush, was a crumpled survey stake with that same Grayson logo. My stomach tightened. They weren't done. I showed Henry when he came out with his coffee, the steam rising from his mug like a warning. He didn't say anything at first, just sipped and stared at the stake in my hand. Then he set his mug on the fence post and said, "Get the dogs ready. We're going for a walk." We followed the creek, Scout and Dusty bounding ahead, their noses low to the ground. It didn't take long to find more signs. Fresh tire tracks in the mud, a broken branch where something heavy had pushed through, and another stake half buried near the water. Henry pulled it free, his jaw tight, and tossed it into the creek. "They're testing us," he said, seeing if we're still watching. That afternoon, we doubled down. I wired 2 more cameras to the fence, angled to catch the bend in the creek where the stakes kept appearing. Henry dragged out an old metal sign from the barn, one he'd made years ago after a dispute with a cattle rustler. It read, "Trespassers will be met with more than words." He hammered it into the ground himself, each swing of the mallet sounding like a promise. The next day, a package arrived in the mail, no return address, just Turner scrawled across the front. Inside was a framed drone photo of the creek bend, showing the fence, the slope, and the rusted-out patrol truck still half submerged in the mud. Someone had written in red marker across the bottom, "We got the message." Henry didn't hang it up. He leaned it against the wall in the barn, next to his tool chest, like a trophy he didn't need to flaunt. When I asked if he thought it was a threat or a surrender, he shrugged. "Could be either. Doesn't matter. They won't be back." But they did come back, or at least someone did. The trail camera pinged again a week later, just as we were finishing lunch. Henry pulled up the feed on his phone, his face unreadable. 2 men, different from the last pair, stood by the creek in work boots and plain jackets. One carried a shovel, the other a metal detector, sweeping it over the ground like they were hunting for buried treasure. They didn't touch the fence, but they were close, too close. Henry didn't grab the tow hook this time. Instead, He called Sheriff Dan and sent him the footage. Got more of Grayson's boys sniffing around, he said into the phone. Might want to swing by before I decide to handle it myself. Dan arrived within the hour, his cruiser kicking up dust as he pulled into the drive. He watched the footage, shook his head, and made a call to the state investigator, Tom Reynolds. This isn't just Grayson anymore, Dan said, rubbing his jaw. We're seeing the same pattern across 3 counties: stakes, fake permits, even small-scale digging. They're not building yet, but they're prepping, and they're banking on folks not noticing. Henry crossed his arms. They noticed us. Dan smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. You've stirred up a hornet's nest, Henry. Grayson's gone, but his investors aren't. They're still pushing, using shell companies to cover their tracks. That photo you got? Probably their way of saying they're watching too. Let them watch, Henry said. They'll see what happens when they step on my land. The sheriff didn't argue. He took the new stake and the footage, promising to add them to the growing case file. Before he left, he handed Henry a card with Reynolds' direct number. Call him if you see anything else, Dan said. This is bigger than we thought. That night, Henry didn't sleep. I found him at the kitchen table, sketching again. Not a fence this time, but a grid of the ranch, with lines marking every access point, every weak spot. He'd circled the creek bend in red and written "No Surrender" next to it. At 52, I'd seen my father stubborn, but this was something else. This was a man digging in for a war he had no intention of losing. The next morning, we got a call from Sarah, the reporter who'd broken the story. She'd been digging into Grayson's operations and found a paper trail leading to a holding company based in Nashville. They were linked to half a dozen similar scams. Fake HOAs, forged permits, even threats to landowners who pushed back. Your story lit a fire, she said. Ranchers are coming forward now, sharing their own evidence. The state's attorney general is involved. Henry listened, then thanked her and hung up. Good, he said, more to himself than to me. Let's make sure they feel the heat. We spent the next few days reinforcing the ranch. I installed motion-activated floodlights along the fence, bright enough to turn night into day. Henry rigged a siren to the gate, the kind that could wake half the county if tripped. We didn't talk much, but the work felt like a conversation. Each post we drove, each wire we tightened, was a statement that this land was ours, and we'd fight for every inch. The following week, a neighbor, Old Man Jenkins from the ranch 5 miles east, stopped by. He was in his 80s, wiry and weathered, with hands like leather from decades of work. Found stakes on my place too, he said, spitting tobacco into the dirt. Pulled them up, but they keep coming back. You think it's the same bastards? Henry nodded. Same game, different players. You got cameras. Jenkins shook his head. Ain't got the cash for that. Borrow one of ours, Henry said, and I knew he meant it. By the end of the day, we'd set up a spare trail cam on Jenkins' property, angled to catch the creek where his stakes had appeared. It felt good, like we weren't just fighting for ourselves anymore. The valley was waking up, and Henry was at the heart of it. A month later, the state made its move. A press release announced the dissolution of Grayson Water Solutions and its subsidiaries, citing systemic fraud and environmental violations. The holding company in Nashville was under investigation, and several executives faced charges. Landowners across Tennessee were filing class action lawsuits, and the attorney general promised to pursue every lead. Sarah's paper ran a follow-up story, with a new photo of Henry leaning against the fence, the creek sparkling behind him. The headline read, Rancher Stan Sparks Statewide Crackdown. Henry didn't read it. He was too busy checking the cameras, walking the fence line, making sure nothing slipped through. But I saw the way neighbors looked at him now. Part respect, part awe, like he'd become a legend without trying. They started calling him the sheriff without a badge, a nickname he hated but couldn't shake. I caught him polishing his old rodeo belt buckle one evening, the silver gleaming under the porch light, and I knew he was proud, even if he'd never admit it. One evening, as the sun dipped below the ridge, Henry set up 2 lawn chairs by the creek. He handed me a root beer, the kind he pretended not to remember buying, and we sat in silence, listening to the frogs and the rustle of cottonwoods. The patrol truck was still there, its decals faded, its frame sinking deeper into the mud. We'd left it on purpose, a monument to anyone who thought they could cross us. "You know," Henry said, breaking the quiet, "I don't build fences to keep folks out. I build them to show where respect starts." I nodded, the weight of his words settling in. The land wasn't just dirt and water. It was memory, history, a promise we'd made to those who came before us. Grayson and his kind thought they could erase that with papers and pipes, but they'd underestimated the Turners. "Think they'll try again?" I asked, glancing at the truck's rusted hood. Henry's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Depends. If they do, the Bulls might handle it. They're better judges of character." We laughed, the sound carrying over the water, easy and free. The fight wasn't over, not completely, but for now, the ranch was ours, and the creek remembered. The Tennessee winter settled over the Turner Ranch like a quiet guest, frosting the grass and turning the creek's edges to glass. The fence stood unwavering, its posts dusted with snow, the solar lights cutting through the early dark. At 52, I'd come to appreciate these cold mornings, not for their beauty, but for the clarity they brought. The land didn't hide its scars in winter. It wore them proudly, and so did we. The rusted patrol truck, still lodged in the creek bank, was now a fixture, its faded decals a silent warning to anyone with bad ideas. Henry, at 78, hadn't slowed down. He was out before dawn, bundled in his old flannel coat, checking the cameras and walking the fence line with Rusty trotting at his heels. The fight with Grayson had left its mark, not on the land, but on him. His eyes were sharper now, his steps more deliberate, like a man who knew the war was won, but the peace was fragile. I'd catch him staring at the creek sometimes, his breath clouding in the air, and I knew he wasn't just looking at water. He was looking at legacy. The state's crackdown on Grayson's company had rippled across the valley. By spring, the holding company in Nashville was bankrupt, its executives indicted for fraud, racketeering, and environmental violations. The class action lawsuits grew, with ranchers from 3 counties pooling their evidence, stakes, forged permits, even threatening letters disguised as compliance notices. Sarah's reporting kept the story alive, her articles shared online until they reached national outlets. The Turner Ranch became a symbol, not just of resistance, but of what happens when you underestimate a man like Henry. But symbols attract attention, and not all of it was welcome. One morning in February, as I hauled feed to the barn, I spotted a black sedan parked just beyond our property line, idling on a county road. Its windows were tinted, its plates out of state. I didn't think much of it at first. Could have been a lost tourist or a salesman, but when I mentioned it to Henry, his jaw tightened. "Keep an eye on it," he said, and I knew he wasn't asking. The sedan didn't show up again, but other things did. A drone buzzed over the creek one evening, too low to be casual. Henry grabbed his shotgun, not to fire, but to make a point, standing on the porch until the drone veered off. A week later, we found a new stake near the southern fence, half hidden in a patch of briars. It bore a different logo this time, but the intent was the same. Henry didn't toss it in the creek. He mailed it to Tom Reynolds at the State Environmental Division with a note. "They're back. Do your job." Reynolds called the next day, his voice tired but resolute. "We're seeing this statewide," he said. "New shell companies, same playbook. They're targeting properties with water access, banking on the Grayson fallout to distract us. Your footage is helping. We've got a task force now." Henry didn't care about task forces. He cared about the ranch. We added more cameras, upgraded the motion sensors, and ran a second line of wire along the creek bend. Henry even bought a new sign, this one welded from scrap metal. "This land remembers." I helped him bolt it to the gate, and when we stepped back, it felt like we'd carved our name into history. The neighbors were watching now, too. Jenkins, the old rancher from down the road, had his own cameras up, thanks to Henry's loan. He'd caught a trespasser on video, a man in a company vest, planting stakes at midnight. Other ranchers started checking their land, pulling up markers, and sharing photos in a group chat Henry refused to join. "Don't need a phone to know who's with me," he'd say, but I saw the way he nodded when Jenkins dropped off a six-pack as thanks. One evening in March, As the first green shoots broke through the soil, Sarah showed up with news. "The Attorney General's office is holding a public hearing," she said, sitting on our porch with a notebook. "They want you to speak, Henry. Your story started this. People need to hear it." Henry leaned back in his chair, his eyes on the creek. "I ain't a speaker," he said. "I'm a rancher." "They're not asking for a speech," Sarah pressed. "Just the truth. You've got the evidence, the photos, the truck in the creek. You're the one who stopped Grayson." I expected him to refuse, but he surprised me. "When's it happening?" he asked. "Next week," she said. "In Nashville." He nodded, and that was that. The idea of Henry in a suit, addressing a room of bureaucrats, was almost laughable, but I knew he'd do it his way. Boots, flannel, and no nonsense. The hearing was held in a bland government building, all fluorescent lights and cheap coffee. The room was packed. Ranchers, reporters, even a few suits who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Henry didn't dress up. He wore his usual jeans and a clean shirt, his rodeo belt buckle catching the light. When it was his turn, he walked to the podium, set down a folder, and looked out at the crowd. "My name's Henry Turner," he said, his voice steady as stone. "I've got 200 acres in Benton County, been in my family since my granddaddy's time. Last year, a man named Walter Grayson sent fake enforcers to my ranch, claiming they were HOA. They parked on my hay, waved clipboards, and thought I'd roll over. I towed their truck into my creek." The room chuckled, but Henry didn't smile. "Then we found stakes, maps, plans to run a pipeline through our water. They weren't just after my land. They were after every ranch in this valley, every creek, every drop. We stopped him, not with lawyers or speeches, but with cameras, fences, and a tow hook. You want to protect folks like us? Don't just write laws. Enforce them, because men like Grayson don't stop unless you make him." He sat down to applause, louder than I'd expected. Ranchers nodded, some clapping him on the shoulder as he passed. The suits shifted uncomfortably, but the Attorney General took notes. Sarah was right. Henry's truth carried weight, and it wasn't just his story anymore. It was everyone's. Back home, the ranch felt quieter, like it was catching its breath. The camera stayed on, the fence held strong, and the creek ran undisturbed. But Henry wasn't one to rest on a win. He started hosting neighbors once a month, not for beers or gossip, but to share what he'd learned, how to spot fake permits, file complaints, set up cameras. "They'll come again," he'd say. "Different name, same game. Be ready." One afternoon, as we mended a gate near the creek, a kid from town dropped off a letter. It was from a lawyer representing the class action group, confirming a settlement for affected landowners. It wasn't millions, but it was enough to cover new equipment, maybe a few extra acres. Henry didn't care about the money. He cared about the second page, a formal apology from the state, acknowledging the failure to protect rural properties from predatory developers. He framed that one, hung it in the barn next to the drone photo. The final piece came in May, a year after the patrol truck hit the creek. Sheriff Dan called to say the last of Grayson's associates had been charged, and the task force had shut down 3 more shell companies. "You did this, Henry," Dan said. "You and that damn tow hook." Henry just grunted. "Didn't do it for me. Did it for the land." That evening, we sat by the creek again, chairs creaking under us, the air warm with the promise of summer. Henry handed me another root beer, and we listened to the frogs, the water, the wind. The truck was still there, half buried now, its frame blending into the bank like it belonged. It wasn't just a wreck. It was a marker, a story etched into the mud. "Land remembers," Henry said, his voice soft but sure. "Who walks it, who works it, who tries to steal it. This creek's got our name on it, and it'll outlast every fool who thinks they can take it." I looked at the water, shimmering under the fading light, and saw what he meant. The ranch wasn't just ours. It was us, every fight, every fence, every stand we'd taken. Grayson had come for the water, crossed the line, and left with nothing but a lesson. The creek remembered, and so would anyone else who tried. As we packed up the chairs, Henry paused, his eyes on the truck's rusted hood. "Next time, I might let the bulls handle it," he said, and this time he grinned, just enough to show he meant it. We laughed, the sound carrying over the water, and headed back to the house. The moonlight hit the creek, turning it silver, and the ranch felt whole, fierce, unbroken, ours. Thank you for riding along with the Turners through this fight for their land. Henry's Stand wasn't just about a creek. It was about justice, pride, and what it means to hold your ground against those who take what's yours. What do you think about Henry's methods? Was towing that truck into the creek a step too far? Or was it the only way to send a message? How do you see violence and injustice playing out in stories like this? Or in your own life? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and let's keep the conversation going. Your voice matters, so take a stand and share it.